Today's video is about quotient rule of derivatives. This is the formula. Let's compare to the product rule of derivative. Derivative of f times g equals f prime times g plus f times g prime. For the quotient rule, we will make a denominator square first. Numerator has the priority of derivative, so we will get f prime times g. Here is a minus. Switch derivative, f times g prime. For the product rule, this is a plus. For the quotient rule, this is a minus. First of all, we will figure out the derivative of certain trig functions. Before we get started, let's talk about derivative of sin x and cosine x. For unit circle, we know the coordinates is CST, cosine, sine, and a tangent. This is x, y over x. In other words, cosine x is on x-axis and sine is on y-axis. So we can label this is cosine x, here is a negative cosine x. This is a sine x, this is a negative sine x. Clockwise, to remember the derivative of sine and cosine. Derivative of sine x is a cosine x. Derivative of cosine x is a negative sine x. Derivative of negative sine x is a negative cosine x. Derivative of negative cosine x is a sine x. Then counterclockwise to remember integral of sine x and cosine x. We will learn this later on. Let's try to figure out the derivative of tangent x. We will change into sine x over cosine x. Then use a quotient rule, cosine square x. Sine x prime times cosine x minus sine x times cosine x prime. Work this out. Derivative of sine x is cosine x times cosine x minus sine x. Derivative of cosine x is negative sine x over cosine square x equals cosine square x. Cosine x times cosine x is cosine square x. Negative negative is a positive, sine square x. We know sine square x plus cosine square x equals 1, so we get 1 over cosine square x. We can write down secant square x. Therefore, for tangent x prime equals secant square x. Using the same way, you can figure out cotangent x prime equals negative cosecant square x. Let's figure out the derivative of cosecant x. We will write down 1 over sine x first for this cosecant x. Then using the quotient rule, sine x squared derivative of 1 times sin x minus 1 times sin x prime. 1 prime will be 0 times sin x minus 1 times derivative of sin x is cosine x sin square x equals 0 times sin x is 0, so we have a negative cosine x sin square x. We will separate this sin square x as sin x times sin x, negative cosine x. We can times 1. So for this negative cosine x over sin x is a negative cotangent x. 1 over sin x is a cosecant x. Therefore, for cosecant x prime equals negative cosecant x times cotangent x. Using the same way, we can figure out secant x prime equals secant x times tangent x. Let's write down the derivative of all 6 trig functions. We can draw a conclusion. When you see co-function, there is a negative sign in the answers. Let's go to guided practice 5. Find the derivative of the followings. F of x equals negative 2x squared over sin x. We got to use the quotient rule of derivatives. Negative 2x squared over sin x prime equals sin x squared. Derivative of negative 2x squared prime times sin x. Subtract. Switch the derivative. Negative 2x squared times sin x prime equals sin square x. Derivative of negative 2x squared is negative 4x sin x. Negative negative is a positive, plus 2x squared. Derivative of sin x is a cosine x. For next question, 3x over e to the x power prime equals e to the x power square. Then 3x prime times e to the x power minus, switch the derivative, 3x times derivative of e to the x power equals e to the x power square. We know e to the x power square, we can write down e to the 2x power according to the power of power rule. But for this question, we can reduce e to the x power. Let me leave as it is. Derivative of 3x is 3 times e to the x power minus 3x times derivative of e to the x power is e to the x power. So we have a common factor e to the x top and bottom. Final answer will be 3 minus 3x over e to the x power. Next question. X third power over natural log of x prime equals natural log of x squared. Then derivative of x to the third power times natural log of x minus, switch the derivative, x third power times the natural log of x prime equals natural log of x squared. Derivative of x to the third power will be 3x squared times natural log of x. Derivative of natural log of x is 1 over x. So negative x third power times 1 over x equals negative x squared. So minus x squared. Before we go to the last question, let's talk about complex fraction. How to simplify this complex fraction 1 over x minus 1 over y over xy. We will find the LCD first. That is xy. So we multiply xy for every single term in this complex fraction. Reduce, we will get y minus x, then x squared, y squared. That's how you simplify this complex fraction. For natural log of x over sin x prime equals sin x squared. Then natural log of x prime times sin x minus, switch the derivative, natural log of x times sin x prime. We will get sin squared x. Derivative of natural log of x is 1 over x times sin x minus natural log of x times derivative of sin x is cosine x. This is a complex fraction. LCD is x, so we just multiply x for every single term. We will get final answer, x times sin squared x. Reduce sin x minus x times natural log of x times cosine x. This is the final answer.